Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the official online version of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, City Lights, in conjunction with the New Press, is honored to present Norman Solomon, celebrating the publication of his new book, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. It is published by the New Press. It is a powerful new expose of how the military-industrial complex, with the help of the media, conceals a state of perpetual war. War Made Invisible is an eloquent moral call for an accounting of the true cost of war. Norman Solomon is an activist. He is a co-founder of rootsaction.org and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. His books include War Made Easy and Made Love, Got War. He makes his home in the San Francisco Bay Area. Joining him tonight in conversation is the wonderful Kris Welch. She is a producer and host at KPFA Radio in Berkeley, California. Before we begin, as is customary at the beginning of each event, I would like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Norman Solomon and Kris Welch. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, all of you, for being here, and especially Norman. So let us just begin and get your questions ready, too, because Peter will be shoveling them at us later. So I'm reading and rereading this book, and I always find something new in it. There it is right there. I hope you have your copies. How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And right now, I think I want to start with this one. During 50 years after the Vietnam War, the United States grew accustomed to asserting its right and power to make war in a variety of distant countries. Major interventions in the 1980s were confined to the Western Hemisphere, tiny island of Grenada. Remember that one? I had dear friends who were there at the time and did a documentary about their experiences. Then Panama. But those two invasions were just opening acts of a rejuvenating quest for geopolitical dominance. And then he quotes George W. Bush saying, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." In fact, that was maybe we should start there with what Vietnam, the experience of Vietnam did, because there was the First World War and the Second World War, and we've just had the anniversaries of the bombings, the only nuclear bombings of civilian populations thus far, knock wood. But Vietnam was a wake-up call in many, many ways. Norman, welcome, and thank you so much for writing this book, and babble on.
Okay, well, I think I'll stick to English. It's like the only language I can really babble in. You know, what you're mentioning, Kris, really reminds me, and I think I have this approximately right, what George Orwell wrote in 1984: those who control the past control the future, those who control the present control the past. And so when there's an effort to extrude, so to speak, from experiences what the Vietnam War meant, I mean, it turned out that was really important, the conclusions that people drew from it. And so when the first President Bush said, after 6 weeks of bombing Iraq in 1991, Pentagon saying about 100,000 Iraqis were killed, that was taken as a great triumph of good warfare by the US media and political establishment. So yeah, President Bush says, by God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. And so here we are in midway plus through 2023. And the conclusions that are being drawn from experiences really are sort of the headlights for the warfare vehicle. This is what we conclude from what happened. And so in that way, we're fighting over history, even as we are challenging, hopefully, the warfare state today.
Because Vietnam was different. Vietnam was sort of a kind of a wake-up call about what our job is and what we were supposed to be doing. And we walked into this. Well, my brother served in Vietnam, so it was, and that was when I was in my 20s, and we were out on the streets, and so it's alive. Vietnam is very much alive to me, and we were happy that it was hard, and that the United States didn't win there, despite the terrible tragedies of everybody that lived in Vietnam. But we also thought that that was the end of war. That, and then it started all this other kind of war that was far away and other people, and it was all mechanical, and we didn't have to worry about anything. So that's what Vietnam taught the establishment, maybe. You tell me. And the media part of that.
The term quagmire was, of course, used, as I remember, by David Halberstam, and then there was a famous moment where Walter Cronkite said in 1968 that it appeared there was a stalemate and that the United States couldn't win. And that's what passed for anti-war sentiment. And I think a huge problem that we continue to have is the difference between concluding that the United States shouldn't fight wars with intervention that it can't win, and the United States has no right to be intervening in the first place. And we have that difference today, where, as Senator Wayne Morse said, that it was just as wrong for the United States to operate on a principle, so to speak, of might makes right, as the Russians to operate on that principle. He said that in 1964, and it's still true in the current century. And when we step back or sort of try to see the overview of US foreign policy in this century up to the moment, I think it is a might makes right policy. The United States, with whether it's Fox News or the New York Times or All Things Considered in Morning Edition, PBS NewsHour, et cetera, the precept is that the United States has the prerogative to work its will on the world militarily as it believes is prudent and conceivably successful. And the counter argument is that there should be something that we adhere to called international law and so forth. And to sort of wrap up that thought, perhaps, when we hear President Biden and Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, saying very gravely that Russia must be condemned because it's just wrong. It's against the needs of the world for one country to invade another. These were people who championed in the Senate as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and chief of staff of that committee midway through 2002 to grease the path for the invasion of Iraq. So, it's quintessentially Orwellian. And in the current moment, I think it's important to recognize that hypocrisy in Washington in no way justifies the slaughter that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine. And at the same time, the slaughter being inflicted on Ukraine in no way justifies not only US hypocrisy, but also ongoing US foreign policy. And in this book, War Made Invisible, I draw on a lot of research, for instance, from the Costs of War project at Brown University, showing that the so-called war on terror has never ended. It's become less visible. There are drone strikes in Africa. There's bombing in Syria, courtesy of US taxpayers. There are special operations going on in many different countries, most of which we don't hear about. Across Africa, the US is training military forces. So-called counterinsurgency is going on, according to the Brown University study, in 85 countries. So as it becomes less and less visible, not on the news that is provided to Americans on a daily basis, the US is functioning as a full-blown warfare state. The $850 billion going to the Pentagon per year, which doesn't even include the nuclear weapons spending, is going somewhere. And, speaking of Vietnam, I'm old enough to remember that sardonic, angry saying, war is profitable, invest your son. That's going back to the 1960s. And now really it's more like war is profitable, invest in Raytheon and Boeing and so forth. So that's where we are, air wars, and the belief that, which is implicit, not really stated out loud, that since the United States has the most powerful military in the world, it is the most righteous. And that in contrast to these crude terrorists who will put explosives into the trunk of a car and blow people up or put on a suicide belt, if you bomb people from 10,000 feet in the air and you slaughter civilians, well, that's just unfortunate for them.
Well, if you do a suicide plane bombing with the plane into the towers, etc.,
Yeah.
live and learn is how you'll.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day when I was looking at a study that's an update from one that I cite in the book, the Cost of War Project at Brown University, very conservatively estimated about 350,000 civilians directly killed by the US so-called war on terror. You add in other direct deaths, it's about 950,000. But then this new study has shown that conservatively 4.5 million people have been killed directly and indirectly from the post 9/11 wars. And if you do the math, that's 3,000 people. And in the names of those 3,000 people, several million people have been killed. It's not a difficult leap to say that this is not only displaced rage that began in October 2001, but also collective punishment of people who are completely innocent in country after country.
You're listening to, as you must know, Norman Solomon about his new book, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And here he says, apropos of what he was just talking about, in media frames the routine exclusion of women harmed by people harmed by, see, I automatically go to me, people harmed by U.S. warfare conveys that they don't really matter much because we rarely see images of their suffering or hear their voices or encounter empathetic words about them. The implicit message comes through loud and clear. The silence ends up speaking at high volume. Those people hardly exist. They are others. They're not our concern. They don't particularly matter while our country is causing their misery. And your many years of media criticism and analysis and participation talk about how that happens, the highly selective coverage of even National Public Radio, our tax dollar paid for media.
A couple of hours ago, I was driving and listening to All Things Considered, one of the crown jewels of NPR News. And there was a very powerful, empathetic story of a couple of young Ukrainian women who toured the country in recent months with their songs to try to shore up people's spirits in the midst of bombing. And then they were killed by a Russian bombing attack. It's very moving. And I thought about how rare to the point of almost non-existence NPR news reporting would chronicle the suffering of people who died under US bombs in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And that sort of doublethink, or what I refer to in the book as the inculcation of a belief in two tiers of grief: people who matter, people who don't. Americans killed in wars, appropriately mourned. Those killed by US firepower, virtually ignored, rarely talked about, empathy not expressed or generated, and all of that. And whatever adjective we might want to use to apply to the political and media establishment, and really, to a large extent, the discourse and the perhaps we might say inner lives of people in the United States, ethically, morally, spiritually, it's a tremendous corrosion that's going on all the time. And it's so routine. It's the proverb of the fish in water, what water, after a while. We're so accustomed to it that the need to wake ourselves up is constant. When I drove today, as is mostly the case, and I imagine everybody on our gathering here has had this experience, I saw Ukrainian flags, and I've never seen a Yemeni flag, even though, or maybe especially because the United States had for so many years and has continued to provide military equipment, fighter bombers, and so forth to Saudi Arabia, while the Saudi-led war on Yemen has continued. There's a little bit of a truce now, but it went on for 7 or 8 years, full bore, beginning in 2015. We had a bipartisan set of presidents, Obama, Trump, Biden, giving aid and political cover to the Saudis as they slaughtered people in Yemen. According to the UN, probably the largest cholera epidemic in history, resulting estimated close to 400,000 people killed there since 2015. So what does it mean that we have all this empathy expressed towards people in Ukraine, complete with flags, and not on the radar, so to speak, politically in terms of media, about people in Yemen? I mentioned in the book a study by the media watch group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, that looked at quite a long stretch of coverage of news by MSNBC. And, that's the liberal network. And FAIR found that while there was tremendous amounts of coverage, hundreds of hours of coverage, prime time, about so-called Russiagate during the administration of Donald Trump, there was virtually no coverage of what was going on in Yemen. And we might say, well, wow, that's in spite of the fact that the United States government was involved in all that killing in Yemen. And we might even say that's because the United States government was involved with the killing in Yemen.
Well, let's talk about money, because inevitably, in a capitalist society, which heaven knows we're in, that's what it gets down to. And one of our participants here is already mentioning the military budget, which is obscene, given all the other things that are needed for humans and the planet. And I keep thinking about World War I, and there were jingoistic journalism then, and yellow journalism, and all kinds of stuff. But it wasn't so huge, and it didn't make that much money. And then all of a sudden, it was corporatized, and now we've got the internet. We're inundated with information, and have real difficulties figuring out what's true and what isn't, and what sources are reliable and what sources are not. But talk about how that money, that explosion of media, and then the bottom line money of the military establishment. Tell us about money.
Yeah, well, the profiteering, if not exactly hidden in plain sight, is pretty much relegated to minor mention. And when the industries that are profiting from war so handsomely, so to speak, are mentioned, the tone is usually, hey, this is good. This is part of what commerce is supposed to be. These are reputable. From a standpoint of, you might say, human concern, a place like Raytheon, that's just making huge profits off of helping the military to kill people, one might think, hey, well, that's not exactly the best kind of use of human ingenuity. But in point of fact, it's very rare in news media, certainly of mass corporate media or so-called public broadcasting like NPR, PBS, very rare to see any aspersions cast on that kind of business activity. And so when we look at the budget, for instance, William Hartung, the great researcher, has put out a report last year, and he said that the military contractors, and we shouldn't call them defense contractors, military contractors, 700 of them full-time on Capitol Hill. They outnumber members of the House and Senate. So they have it down. One example that I give is Adam Smith. Don't know, certainly not the Scottish economist, but he was until this year the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. And he had enormous power over who got contracts for the Pentagon. And during the most recent cycle, as this book went to press, he got $400,000 from the military industries. So naturally, he had a good relationship. So one other thought on this, Kris, is that during World War II, one of the ways that then Senator Harry Truman became renowned was he held hearings on Capitol Hill. This is during the Second World War. And he really lambasted what were called war profiteers. And in recent years, I sort of look around, where is the media coverage? Where's the denunciation of, quote, war profiteers? We just really don't see it.
So, and what what should the media, what could the media be doing? I'm thinking about the poor taxpayers, all of us out here trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong and what's fake and what's true, and what is our power? Because obviously they are very afraid of the power that our knowing the truth might have. I'm not, because otherwise, why would the media be so insistent on, oh, don't look over here, look over there?
Yeah, well, certainly enmeshed in what we could call now the military industrial media surveillance high-tech complex. And so the boards of directors are often interlocked. There is a lot of advertising that comes directly or indirectly from war-associated industries. And there's also a sensibility, the revolving door that moves in both directions, from government to high or visible media positions, or vice versa. It's become very common that White House spokespeople used to be a media figure, or the other way around, think George Stephanopoulos, and it's what gets normalized. And when people come into the profession, young journalists, you want to be successful. What's the role model? What defines professionalism? Well, it's the people who are farther along in the profession, who've achieved more, who've gained some modicum of acclaim and so forth. And so that defines what journalism in practice is, not in theory. The New York Times motto, without fear or favor, sounds pretty good. But in fact, so to speak, the window on the world is tinted red, white, and blue. And it's a truism in the US context in terms of the US wars. If you are a pro-war, you're objective. If you're anti-war, you're biased. And in the book, and I think this is a consequence of the corporate power, who owns the big media outlets, who advertises on them, all the corporate interlocks and sensibilities with government officials. I give two examples that were major, one somewhat well-known, some less known. Major one is Phil Donahue, who on MSNBC had the temerity to have anti-war guests in the mix as the United States was gearing up towards invading Iraq in late 2002 and early 2003. And we don't have to conjecture why his show, Phil Donahue's show, was canceled by MSNBC just a few weeks before the invasion of Iraq. He was a top-rated show, highest rated in primetime, canceled anyway. There was a leak of two memos from MSNBC and NBC saying that we're really worried that Donahue seems to delight in bringing on anti-war guests when our competitors at Fox and CNN are waving the flag. And so ipso facto, e pluribus unum, whatever, it seemed logical, well, fire the guy. This is not what we're about. Another example, less well known, is Ashley Banfield, someone who was a young up-and-coming correspondent. She happened to be right in the vicinity of the Twin Towers on 9/11. She broadcast live from there at MSNBC and then NBC. She was seen as a rising star, perhaps to take Katie Couric's anchor chair finally on the evening news. She was sent to cover the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, but she made one big career mistake. She was truthful about the impacts of war. She gave one speech at a university in Kansas, and her big network career was basically toast in 1 hour. This was a few weeks after the Saddam Hussein statue fell in Baghdad. And she said in her speech that there's a difference between coverage and journalism. She said, we in the networks showed you what happens when the missiles are launched, but we didn't show you what happened when the missiles landed. And I can assure you, it's not just a bunch of dust and some puffs of smoke. She immediately was trashed by top management at NBC. Ironically enough, the speech was in Manhattan, Kansas. They were back in Manhattan in New York. And it was just, she had spoken some truth in an outlying area that was not to be permitted at the NBC headquarters. So the news releases came out fast and furious. Ms. Banfield does not speak for the network. She did not mean to denigrate the work of her colleagues. She will choose her words more carefully in the future. But on the network, she didn't have an opportunity to choose her words more carefully, because when she returned, she was basically put in a tape closet, and they would not let her out of her contract. And it was very vindictive. And she was an object lesson, just as Phil Donahue was.
Norman Solomon with us with his new book, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And lots of folks here online. That's wonderful listening. And before we go to them, because I know they have questions and I'm seeing really good things coming in at the bottom of the screens here, I wanted to address this, your chapter 7, which is entitled The Color of War. And when we were talking on KPFA on Friday, I brought this up, that I remember so vividly these images of Ukrainians fleeing the war, and they looked like white folks here in middle America. They were little puff jackets and their kids, and blonde and blue-eyed, and we do not see people fleeing war who are brown for some reason. Talk about that.
Some of the reporting said the silent stuff out loud in the early weeks of the Russian attack on Ukraine. Statements like, oh, these victims of war, they look like us, which is, an ugly statement, to put it mildly, but that was said a number of times through major US media outlets. And I think if you leave aside, which is huge, the political bias, the spin, the ahistorical coverage through US media of the Ukraine war and what led up to it, such as NATO expansion, the actual coverage of the suffering in Ukraine has been really good. There's a lot of quality ongoing coverage to convey that war is just so horrific in so many ways. Unfortunately, that kind of coverage has been very rare when the victims are the victims of US firepower. And that is really, I think, a result of a number of key factors. One is ideological, that when the US is doing the killing, that the presumption is, the received wisdom is, that any unfortunate killing is just that. It's not intentional. It doesn't reflect on our character as a nation. And I point out in the book, the killing of civilians in the war on terror, so-called, was totally and has been totally predictable. So there is that facet. There also is just the designated US enemy, when it kills, by definition, is inherently evil. Whereas when the United States kills, well, we just made a mistake. Something else that really hit me when I was working on this book is to realize that virtually all of those who have been killed by US firepower in the so-called war on terror have been people of color. And talk about hidden in plain sight. And I actually, there's a whole chapter, as you say, Kris, titled Color of War, that explores that in some depth. And when I've written about this in recent weeks and sent to some of our august media outlets as an op-ed piece, like they're all rejected. It's like, and it's not as though, oh, we've already had an op-ed about this. No, they haven't. It's just like, oh, well, this is like, really, this is into a no-go zone. So don't talk about it. Don't even point it out. And as I say in the book, the United States doesn't bomb countries because they're inhabited by people of color. But the fact that they're inhabited by people of color makes it easier to engage in warfare on those countries. And I think it's very notable in the last few years that it's a good thing. There's been more and more talk about structural racism. Systemic racism is a word that until a few years ago was just on the left that we'd hear about systemic racism. Now it's become more widely discussed, not enough, but at least more widely. And yet the reality that government and corporate power is affected by systemic racism, still there's virtually no discussion in the mass media about how it affects foreign policy. It's as though structural racism, systemic racism only affects domestic policy, which, as the saying goes, strains credulity.
Norman Solomon and his newest book, War Made Invisible.
And Kris, let me jump in before
I forget. Tell me what you want to talk about.
Well, no, I'm glad. I've been happy to be talking at people here, and all your questions really on point. Before I forget, when we build counter messaging, counter sensibilities, counter institutions, they really need to be sustained. And that has to do with TV, radio, newspapers, websites, and also has to do with bookstores and the book industry. And so one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be here this evening is City Lights Books. As a publisher, as a bookstore, this is truly one of the greatest booksellers in US history. And so I want to remind folks of that, whether you're thinking about buying a book tonight, whether you're going to be in San Francisco at some time in the future, or can remember to go to the City Lights website, we've got to support our own institutions. And I do want to add as well, for Kris, I don't know if it's okay if I call you an institution, but you've been on KPFA for many, many decades and always enlightening, always keeping the banner high for a humane future. So thank you for that. And KPFA should be supported as well.
There are those who have suggested I need to be institutionalized, but that's another altogether.
That's a very different word.
I want to also repeat, as I did on Friday, because it moved me. When you get to the acknowledgments page at the end of the book, Norman begins by saying, memories of people I met in Iraq and Afghanistan. He traveled many, many times to Baghdad, as he says, and felt like he was on two different planets before the US invasion. People, going out to dinner and sitting in a cafe, and at the same time they're talking about, let's see, what kind of bomb should we use in Washington? Anyway, memories of people I met in Iraq and Afghanistan challenged me to avoid abstraction while writing this book. What I learned from them is beyond measure. And he pays some of that debt with this book and with his ongoing, as long as I've known him, the deep and strong passion that he has for conveying the truth about especially things that kill people, war and nuclear weapons. I don't know how you sleep at night, Norman, knowing as much as you do about the most awful things that humans can do, really.
Well, I think now maybe in some respects even more than ever, because of the looming threat of nuclear war, the superpower confrontations going on, I think a lot of us are feeling a heightened sense of urgency. Anxiety doesn't even describe it in some ways. And it's about being in touch with what we don't want to be reality, but really is. We don't get to live in the world we want to live in. This one is run by murderers, I hate to say it, in terms of government. And so we have that challenge in a country such as this that has some elements of democracy to find the spaces and expand them that could create a better future.
What I did. So I wanted to have my grandson say hello, "Mwah." Mandela, which is one of the reasons the next generations is what's the world that they're inheriting. Anyway, I could see you're going to have some ramen. So we have people that have questions that are all with us here. So I'd like to let them come into the whatever this is, and I think that that's Peter's job. Do I do anything? I also I commented when we first joined the thing that Peter and Norman and I are all sitting in front of books, even though we're not all in the same place. I just sort of like that part.
A great thing. So let's run through here, and we've got quite a bit of stuff going on. Let's see. Let's scroll up to the beginning. David asks, what do you think of a land value tax as a primary source of revenue would illuminate what we pay taxes for? Roads or missiles, schools or bombers, healthcare or drones?
Well, at least the polling I've seen shows that if the questions are asked reasonably, most people want spending to go for lack of a better phrase, human needs, and do not want the Pentagon to be running away with the budget, which now the discretionary federal budget is 55% or so for the military, and that's been rising. We were talking earlier, I was quoting Orwell about the past and the future and control. And I think on this point that the destruction of history is so important as a means of control. And when we hear about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, of course, it was very beautiful. It is still very relevant. And then we do not hear in the mass media, virtually never, about his 1967 speech at Riverside Church on April 4th. And in that speech, a year before he was murdered, he talked about military spending, runaway military spending, as a, quote, destructive, demonic suction tube, unquote. So imagine all of these politicians, even Republicans, who love to pop up once in a while praising King and talk about I have a dream. How often do they talk about their military spending as a demonic suction tube? I don't think so.
So Jarvis says, hi, Norman, Nader fellow here. What do you make of the new emphasis of so-called elites, quote unquote, on correcting alleged disinformation? There's even a new term, malinformation. What do you make of this new focus of dominant groups in academia, think tanks, etc.?
Yeah, it's quite a swirling puzzle right now because there are so many forces messaging all the time, and the ones with the biggest megaphones have the dominance over what is misinformation, what is disinformation. I have an entire chapter in the book called Repetition and Omission, where what is left out is often the most powerful. So yes, we should challenge the misinformation, but also it's the omissions. I have a quote at the beginning, actually an epigraph from Aldous Huxley, who says, lies are powerful, but even more powerful is silence about truth. And I think that's where we are. And so just to digress slightly and hopefully quickly, the social media has, and the web has lowered the barriers to entry for progressives, but it also obviously has given a lot of empowerment to people who are excelling in lies, in hate, and in distortion of history, in nativism, racism, misogyny, and so forth. And one other thought is that if we're going to turn this around, we have a responsibility to, along with the other realms of propaganda, recognize what is not only infotainment, but disinfotainment. We're constantly getting disinfotainment in the movies, TV that is supposed to be entertaining us. And that's, as Antonio Gramsci would talk about, this has given us sensibilities that normalize and make very specific pro-corporate and repressive sensibilities common sense. And we're encouraged to believe this is common sense. You spend all this money on the military, it's common sense. You leave it to the market, common sense.
Cynthia mentions, do you mention the military's contribution to climate destruction in your book?
I do, only briefly. I had to felt I needed to sort of confine myself to the subtitle, how the military toll is hidden, the human toll. And of course, the environmental destruction is also going to destroy human beings, but for better and worse, I sort of focused it. That said, the fact is that the single institution on the planet most responsible for negative climate change is the Pentagon. And it's very difficult to get that into the media.
Mm.
While we're waiting for more questions to come in, actually, I have a question. For educators who are interested in teaching critical thinking to youth regarding this subject, and with new media and technology now creating very, very different environments for our senses and challenges to our senses. I'm wondering, do you have thoughts on this?
In terms of how the pedagogy of the oppressed 2023?
Yes, thank you. You got it. Yeah.
Well, if I was wearing a hat, I would have my hat off to the teachers who are really in very dire circumstances. And I'm not only talking in Florida, but across the country. The overload, the lack of resources, the huge classes, the social forces that are beyond the control of anybody inside the schoolhouse, and yet teachers get blamed for the problems that they're doing their best quite often to try to mitigate. Other material is really important, and I think that's again where books come in, where radio programs, where podcasts. I've worked a lot with the Media Education Foundation, which is a 501c3. It's terrific. I was lucky enough that they adapted my earlier book, War Made Easy, into a documentary. And almost all of their films are provided to college and high schools. And it really makes a difference. So it's an ongoing battle. And unfortunately, the most powerful educators in the United States are the media. And that has to be changed.
Yeah. We have question from Diana. What do you make of the lack of response to Bernie's opposition to war spending or progressive attempts to rein in military spending? How might these efforts gain traction?
This is a reference to Bernie Sanders, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm biased about Bernie. I love his domestic politics. I was lucky enough to be a Bernie delegate in 2016 and 2020 to the national conventions. And this is sort of the good news and bad news, he made history by being a unique member of the Congress who announced, I'm not going to vote for an increase in military spending. And it's too bad that's conspicuous, that's so unusual. We need pressure. We're way too nice to elected members of Congress. I don't care if they're in the Progressive Caucus or not. They're going along with the war program right now, with very rare exceptions. And why we need to go out of our way to thank members of Congress who do things we like, and then stay silent or overly polite when they gin up the war machine, I just don't get it. It's a acculturation that says, oh, they're serving us, we should be grateful. It's a cliche, but it's true. They're supposed to work for us. And to get a little Bay Area here, our entire delegation to the House of Representatives has jumped on the war train in terms of Ukraine without demanding diplomacy. yes, let's vote for one huge quantity of weapons to Ukraine after another. But oh no, we can't impose, quote unquote, any diplomacy whatsoever on the situation. I think it's madness. And I think this kind of groupthink that unfortunately the Democrats in Congress are part of really is incredibly destructive. And without conflating the eras, this reminds me of 1964, when there was a Democrat in the White House and we had members of Congress, with two exceptions, Greening and Morse in the Senate, voting for war out of 535. We've got to change that. That's up to us. And a brief plug, at rootsaction.org, we're coordinating diffuse nuclear war campaigns. And the last week of September, there are going to be decentralized picket lines and other actions around the country at congressional offices and so forth. And everybody's invited. You can go sign up. We'll give you action alerts. And that's at diffusenuclearwar.org.
Well, we have more questions coming in, but we're coming to the top of the hour. So, Kris, I was wondering, do you have any last thoughts, any last questions you'd like to pose?
No, but I'm going to return to a reference that Norman made, which is his introductory quotes here from Aldous Huxley, where he says, as Norman mentioned, the greatest triumphs of propaganda have been accomplished not by doing something, but by refraining from doing. Great is truth, but still greater from a practical point of view is silence about truth. Silence equals death. Remember that from the AIDS campaign. War made invisible. Thank you, Norman, so much, and keep on keeping on.
Thank you, Kris. Thank you, Peter, and everybody who's on our gathering tonight.
Well, I thank you both for a very engrossing conversation. It's such an honor to have you both in our virtual halls. Kris Welch, thank you for doing the honors. Norman Solomon, congratulations on another really compelling and very, very important book.
Read more books.
Yes, we posted links in the chat, so please check those out. Yet better yet, we're in North Beach. Come on down, visit the hood, browse our stacks. As I mentioned earlier in the chat, we have a very extensive poli-sci, journalism, muckraking, numerous sections.
How's your children's section?
Yes, we have a massive, massive children's and
young
section. So come on down. We're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. We are getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. Also want to point out City Lights is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. We're going to be featuring a special calendar of events. It is running through to the end of the year. It's going to include both live in-store and online. We've got a poetry reading coming up this coming weekend on Sunday in Kerouac Alley, beginning at 1, ending at 5. There's going to be music, poetry. Come on down, hang out with us. Also, keep an eye on our calendar for pending announcements for more events. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, which continues the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. I hope to see you all again soon. Be well.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody.